So we're going to continue our exploration of the birth of Yeshua. So we spent some time in Matthew, looking at the beginning of Matthew and how that starts. And we looked at the difference between Matthew and Luke versus John, which is something completely different, not even dealing with these kinds of things. And we talked about the difference between Matthew and Luke and Mark, which is an historical narrative, but doesn't deal with the beginning at all. So the two that are parallel in this, and only sort of, are Matthew and Luke. So we looked at Matthew 1 last week. So let's start with Luke chapter 1 today. So after a brief introduction, the narrative really starts in verse 5. It says, in the days of Herod, king of Yehuda, there was a Kohen named Zakaria who belonged to the Aydat division. His wife was a descendant of Aharon, and her name was Elisheva. Okay, so we've got a pair of Kohens here. What does this have to do with Yeshua? Nothing. We're not talking about Yeshua. We're talking about the parents of John the Bathtub, John the Immerser. Okay? Which, in the Gospel of Matthew, we didn't talk about this at all, right? First time we hear about John the Immerser is at the Jordan River much later. The birth of John the Baptist is not discussed. So in the days of Herod king of Yehuda was a Kohen named Zakaria, okay, who belonged to the Aydat division. What does that mean? His wife was a descendant of Aaron, and her name was Elisheva. Both of them were righteous before God, observing all the mitzvot and ordinances of Hashem blamelessly. Okay, we'll get to that one in a minute. First of all, what's the Aydat division? Now, the only way you understand this is if you've studied Talmud. Okay, so first off, at this time, there were about as many Jews in the world as there are today. Roughly 12, 13 million Jews in the world. A lot of them lived in Israel in that area. Of the 13, let's call it 12 million, it wasn't this even, but you could figure that by tribe, there were roughly 1 million per tribe. So the tribe of Levi had 1 million people in it, roughly. And of course, they're supported, for the most part, by all the other tribes. Okay, now, among Levi, 10% of them are Kohens. So you're looking at 100,000 Kohens. How many Kohens can do duty in the temple at any given time? A handful. A dozen. You're not talking about a lot of people being able to, to the point where if you got to do service in the temple as a Kohen, any time in your lifetime, you were fortunate. So how are things divided up? Because there's a lot of duties for Kohens, not only in the temple, but that's the focus. But there's duties for Kohens all over the country, right? You got to have Kohens there to look and see about tzaras, see if there's clean and unclean things, to make rulings about things, to handle temple shekels, for people that are making tithes or gathering bikurim or whatever you're doing. So you got to have Kohens all over the country. And so we did. So who gets to serve in the temple and when? So we take all of the tribes and you say for each tribe area in the country, the Kohens from that tribe, twice a year, got to spend a week serving in the temple. So they would pick up and they would go to Jerusalem and they'd live in Jerusalem and they'd serve in the temple. 2 weeks a year. Okay? And they spread them out. So it wasn't just 2 weeks in a row. It was 1 week and then, okay. So each one of these is called a mishmarah. the root being shomer, which is to protect. A mishmarah was your division that got called to duty in the temple twice a year. And the divisions had names. Zakaria was from Yehuda, right? So Yehuda had two mishmarot. One of them was the Aviyah division. So when the Aviyah division got called up, Zakaria went down to Jerusalem with all of his other buddies in his mishmarah, and they actually handled the temple service for the week. It was a pretty cool thing. And then within the temple itself, again, the only way you know this is by studying Talmud, because that's where it's written down.
Right.
Okay? So when they were in the temple, they would actually draw lots to make it fair. Now, as to who got what duty. In more corrupt times, they didn't. It was assigned, and there was graft involved, and there were all kinds of bad things. But ideally, they drew lots, and whatever lot they drew, that was their duty, right? So there was a Kohen to hold the animals for the sacrifice. There was a Kohen to actually make the shechita, to make the cut for the sacrifice. There's a Kohen to collect the blood. There's a Kohen to set the fires on the altar. There's Kohens to help shovel the ashes off of the altar. There was Kohens to tend the menorah. There were a bunch of them. So the menorot in the temple building itself deal with the wicks, make sure that there's enough oil in them, make sure they're lit every evening, right? There's for the incense altar, there were Kohens that lit the incense, right? So there's Kohens that handled the lechem panim, the showbread. So there's different assigned duties, right? Okay, and they got to them by drawing lots. That comes into play a little later. Okay, so Zakaria belonged to the Aviyah division. So he was serving in the temple. We'll get to that, okay. His wife was a descendant of Aaron, so she's a Kohen also, and he's doing it right. Her name was Elisheva. Both of them were righteous before God, observing all the mitzvot and ordinances of Adonai blamelessly. This is a very important sentence that is ignored by much of the body of Messiah. This whole concept that you can't do all the mitzvot is completely blown out of the water with this sentence. They did them all. They're blameless before God. They're tzaddikim. You could do it. Ordinary human beings could do it. Yeshua didn't come to save us from sin because you can't not sin. You can. You just have to make the choice to do it. Today's a little different. We don't have the temple, so there's a whole bunch of commandments we cannot do. But in that time, sure, here's a couple of people that did. The point is, yes, if these two could do it, no doubt others were doing it. This was not something that was unheard of. But they had no children because Elisheva was barren. And they were both well along in years. One time when Zakaria was fulfilling his duties as a Kohen, during his division's period of service before God, now you know what that means. Okay? Call of duty. So off he went. He was chosen by lot, according to the custom of the Kohanim, to enter the temple and burn incense. Now, we don't get this. But there is no higher duty in the temple than the burning of the incense. The burning of the incense is really the gateway to every one of the sacrifices. It is considered the most important offering every single day, is the burning of the incense. And we can go back to Nadav and Avihu not getting it right and getting zapped. Okay? So this is the duty of highest responsibility and the duty of highest renown. Okay? So to get this is a big ooh. And if you're getting it by lot, there's jealousies involved. All the people were outside praying at the time of the incense burning. Okay? All the people were outside praying at the time of the incense burning. What does this mean? The incense is burned first thing in the morning. Everybody outside. If we did an entire Shacharit service, the beginning of the service includes the order of the burning of the incense, right? And the people outside are reading this portion of the Torah and praying. Why are they outside? Because only the Kohanes came to the inside, right? Okay, so we're looking in the temple at the outer room of the temple. And what's in the outer room of the temple? The menorah, the table with the lechem panim, the showbread, which has little bowls of frankincense all through it. Okay, so that's burned. And the golden altar for the incense. And then the back wall is basically a huge pair of huge thick curtains with cherubim on them. Curtains, of course, were talat. They were this scarlet red, and the cherubim were on there in gold thread. Okay, that's all that was in that room. You go behind the curtain, behind curtain number one. Carol, what do we have? Yeah. Behind curtain number one is the Ark of the Covenant and the jar of manna and Aaron's staff and the scroll of the Torah. Okay, but they're not behind there. They're in front of that. But nobody could come in there, so everybody's in the outside praying. And every morning, this is what happened. Every single morning. When there appeared to him, this is Zakaria, an angel of Adonai standing to the right of the incense altar. Now, we know where the incense altar was in the structure of the temple, again, from the Talmud. It told us where we put it. So the incense altar, if you walked straight in, there were doors. Open the doors, you walk straight in, and facing you at the far end was the incense altar. On your right side was the table of the bread of faces. And on the left side was the menorah. Now, starting with King Solomon, there was more than one menorah. He started to put menorahs in there. I think Talmud teaches us that he had 12 menorahs in there. So and we're a little unclear, if I remember right, but there may have been considerably more than that on the left side. Okay? So the menorah, the bread, and then straight ahead. Okay, so there's the incense altar, the golden incense altar, which is, 4 feet high and gold. And then behind, if you're looking at it, behind the incense altar was the parochet, was the curtain with the cherubim in gold on the curtain. Okay, now this was a curtain. This thing is 3 feet thick, right? And the lady Kohanes weaved it, and they did a new one every year. And they would finish weaving the parochet, and it would get put up. They would immediately start another one. It took them a year to weave it. But important to understand, there is a cheruv on this parochet, huge, in gold thread. So this angel is appearing to Zakaria, standing in front of an image of a cheruv in gold, huge, right in the temple, okay? This is a big deal. And Zakaria was startled and terrified at the sight. Why is Zakaria terrified? And why is the angel there? What happens if you do the incense wrong?
Yeah, you're out of here.
Okay, and who's going to come tell you you're gone? Okay, so you're in the Heichal. You're in that outer room. You're standing in front of the incense altar. You've got 1 week a year, and you're the guy that got the lot drawn to do this. And, you do it right. And then there's this angel that appears to you. Oh, uh-oh. But the angel said to him, and it's malacha in Aramaic, it is an angel. Now the word malach, which is the Hebrew, which actually means messenger, but it is a generic term for any celestial creature. So it's like when we use the word Torah. What does Torah mean? Well, Torah means the 5 books of Moses, but sometimes Torah means the entire Tanakh. And sometimes it means both the Tanakh and the Talmud. It depends on the context in which you're using it. Same with a malach. So a malach is a specific type of messenger, or it's any of the celestial beings, right? So what are the celestial beings we're talking about? Well, there's malachim, right? And there's Ophanim, the wheel guys, and there's Chayot HaKodesh, the holy animals, and there's Srafim, the fire angels, and Cheruvim, we got the Cheruvim. Okay, so there's actually a bunch, and they're all listed out in Ezekiel chapter 1. Okay, so by saying this is a malach, it's unclear what type of angel this is. Okay, it's a generic term. It's a celestial being, no doubt. This is a beyond time and space kind of experience and creature. And he said, don't be afraid, Zakaria, because your prayer has been heard. Your wife Elisheva will bear you a son, and you are to name him Yochanan. He will be a joy and a delight to you, and many people will rejoice when he is born. For he will be great in the sight of Adonai. He is never to drink wine or other liquor. He will be filled with Ruach HaKodesh, even from his mother's womb. Not to drink wine at all. What does this mean? What is this talking about? Yet not Nazarene. Nazirite. Okay, and in English, this is an important distinction, because Nazarene is somebody from Nazareth.
Right.
Okay, Nazirite is someone who has taken the vow of the Nazir. Now, occasionally in the history of the Jewish people, we come across literally a handful of people who don't take the Nazirite vow. They are assigned the vow of the Nazir from birth. Samson is one of these, right? Samuel is another one, okay? And here we have another one. Yochanan is being assigned the vow of the Nazir since birth. Now, the vow of the Nazir is a big deal. Paul took the vow of the Nazir later, okay? So even amongst believers, the vow of the Nazir is a big deal. He will go out ahead of Adonai in the spirit and power of Eliyahu to turn the hearts of the fathers to their children and the disobedient to the wisdom of the righteous, to make ready for Adonai a people prepared. Now, we talked last week about the whole idea of Ruach HaKodesh. Okay, and Ruach HaKodesh here means the same thing it does in Matthew. Okay? There is no definite article. It does not say the Ruach HaKodesh. What it says is a spirit of holiness. It doesn't say ha-rucha diktusha in Aramaic. It says rucha diktusha, a spirit of holiness. This is a big deal because in modern parlance, because the definite article has been, or supporting this, the definite article being injected in there, it tends to read like the Ruach HaKodesh is a separate entity, that it is a separate being. Don't think about it that way. Think about the Ruach HaKodesh as being inspiration, wisdom, understanding, knowledge, being given by God, okay, as opposed to a separate being. Okay, so we see here that the angel is telling Zakaria that his son is going to be a herald, that he's to go out and do what? Exactly the same thing as every prophet of Israel had before him. go out and proclaim to people, turn from sin, return to God. That's his job. Okay? This is what he's going to do. This is what the angel is telling Zakaria. Note, the angel does not tell Zakaria anything about the Messiah. Zakaria said to the angel, "How can I be sure of this? For I'm an old man. My wife, too, is well on in her years." The angel answered him, "I am Gabriel." Gabriel is one of the big ones. He's a cherub. Okay? And he can appear as a man. He can appear as a malach, as a messenger. So the fact that he has to identify himself is not unusual. And he says, "I stand in the presence of Hashem, and I was sent to speak to you to give you this good news. Now, because you didn't believe what I said, which will be fulfilled when the time comes, you'll be silent, unable to speak until the day these things take place." Meanwhile, the people were waiting for Zakaria, and they were surprised it was taking so long in the temple, and concerned. By the way, it doesn't say that, but you bet. But when he came out and unable to talk to them, they realized he had seen a vision. Speechless, he communicated to them with signs. Why would they think that he'd seen a vision? Because this is not uncommon in the temple. People had visions in the temple all the time. This was something that happened. When the period of his temple service was over, he returned home, and following this, Elisheva, his wife, conceived and remained 5 months in seclusion, saying, "Adonai has done this for me. He has shown me favor at the time, so as to remove my public disgrace." What was her public disgrace? Being barren. None of this is in Matthew. In the 6th month, the angel Gabriel was sent by God to a city in the Galilee called Nazirite, to a virgin engaged to a man named Joseph of the house of David. The virgin's name was Miriam. Approaching her, the angel said, "Shalom, favored lady, Adonai is with you." Okay, now, it's Gabriel again. Okay, so she was deeply troubled by his words and wondered what kind of greeting this might be. The angel said to her, "Don't be afraid, Miriam, for you have found favor with God. Look, you will become pregnant, and you will give birth to a son, and you are to name him Yeshua. He will be great. He will be called Son of HaElyon, Adonai. God will give him the throne of his forefather David, and he will rule the house of Yaakov forever. There will be no end to his kingdom." "How can this be?" asked Miriam, "since I'm a virgin?" And he answered her, "The Ruach HaKodesh will come over you. The power of HaElyon will cover you. Therefore, the holy child born to you will be called the Son of God." Oh boy. Now, looking at this in the Aramaic, it's considerably different, as one would expect. But let's go ahead and break down this whole bit. Okay, you will become pregnant, you will give birth to a son, and you're to name him Yeshua. Fine. He will be great. And he will be called, again, no definite article. It's not, he will be called the Son of HaElyon. It says he will be called a Son of HaElyon. The implications are considerably different. Adonai, God, will give him the throne of his forefather David, and he will rule the house of Yaakov forever. There will be no end to his kingdom. "How can this be?" asked Miriam of the angel, "since I am a virgin?" Okay, so that's the question. How can her son rule the house of Yaakov forever? What does that mean? People are born, they live, they die. Forever isn't part of that vocabulary. But a spirit of holiness will come over you. The power of HaElyon, and the words are fascinating, will sing upon you. Sing. And the child in holiness will be called a son of God. There is no definite article there. There's no the. This is in no way implying that Yeshua is not the Son of God. I'm just explaining what the text actually says. Okay? And the prophecy that's given to Miriam here is not an indication of divinity. The troubling part is the forever bit for her. What does that mean, forever? You have a relative, Elisheva, who is an old woman. Everyone says she is barren, but she has conceived a son and is 6 months pregnant. For with God nothing is impossible. Miriam said, I'm a servant of Adonai. May it happen to me as you said. Then the angel left her. Without delay, Miriam set out and hurried to the town in the hill country of Yehuda, where Zakaria lived, and entered his house and greeted Elisheva. When Elisheva heard Miriam's greeting, the baby in her womb stirred. Elisheva was filled with a spirit of holiness and spoke in a loud voice, how blessed are you among women, and how blessed is your child in your womb. That was quick. So when Miriam was catching wind of all of this, it must have been very troubling. How is she going to deal with the community? While it wasn't unheard of for young ladies that were engaged, let's have a wedding and, 5 months later, oh, look, a baby. That's miraculous. This was fairly common. It was not uncommon. We even see that today, and we just rejoice. We just rejoice. Oh, you want one of those wedding dresses? Oh, okay. But who am I, the mother of my Lord, that the mother of my Lord should come to me? For as soon as the sound of your greeting reached my ears, the baby in my womb leapt for joy. Indeed, you are blessed because you have trusted that the promise of Adonai is made to you will be fulfilled. Then Miriam let rip with some poetry. Verse 56, Miriam stayed with Elisheva for about 3 months and then returned home. Okay, so some quick math. And it's about the time that Elisheva was going to give birth. Miriam returned home. Right, so the time arrived for Elisheva to have her baby, and she gave birth to a son, and her neighbors and relatives heard how good Adonai had been to her, and they rejoiced with her. On the 8th day, they came to do the child's Brit Milah. They were about to name him Zakaria after his father, when his mother spoke up and said, nope, he's to be called Yochanan. And they said to her, none of your relatives says that name. Okay, so to this day, the tradition, not commandment, but the tradition is within Judaism to name a son in particular after a deceased relative to honor them. Not a living one. This can cause problems, right, with jealousies and all kinds of things. But a deceased relative. And they made signs to the father to find out what he wanted. And he motioned for a writing tablet, and everyone's surprised. He wrote, his name is Yochanan. At that moment, the power of speech returned, and his first words were a blessing to God, a bracha. All the neighbors were awestruck, and throughout the hill country of Yehuda, people talked about all these things. Everyone who had heard of them said to themselves, what is this child going to be? For clearly the hand of Hashem was with him. Okay, the hill country of Yehuda, that's Beit Lechem, Chevron, and all of the surrounding area to the edge of the Midbar Yehuda, to the Judean desert. His father Zakaria was filled with spirit of holiness and spoke this prophecy. Praise be Adonai, the God of Israel, because he has visited and made a ransom to liberate his people by raising up for us a mighty deliverer who is a descendant of his servant David. It is just as he has spoken through the mouth of the prophets from the very beginning, that we should be delivered from our enemies and from the power of all who hate us. Okay? This gives us wonderful insight, again, just as in Matthew, what the expectations were of a messianic leader. The messianic expectation is that this Messiah would come specifically to save Israel from the Romans. That's the expectation. That's what the Messiah is coming to do. So if this kid is going to be it, the end is in sight. We can see it. He's going to deliver us from what? From the oppression of the Romans. Talking to Mary, you child will be called a prophet of HaElyon, and you will go before the Lord to prepare his way by spreading the knowledge among his people that deliverance comes by having sins forgiven through our God's most tender mercy, which causes the sunrise to visit us from heaven, to shine upon those in darkness, living in the shadow of death, and to guide our feet into the paths of peace. The child grew and became strong in Ruach, and he lived in the wilderness until the time came for him to appear in public to Israel. This is a very, very different introduction and narrative about the birth of Yeshua than we see in Matthew. Okay? What are some of the elements that we see in Matthew? How about Chachamim, Magi?
Yeah.
There's no Magi.
Yeah.
How about fleeing for Egypt?
Doesn't talk about the stable.
Doesn't talk about the stable. Okay? It doesn't talk about any of that.
Not about the rotten taxes, not.
Right? Doesn't talk about the gifts being brought. Doesn't talk about Herod wanting to kill. It doesn't talk, okay?
Yeah.
What it does talk about is John the Baptist and the Kohanes, Zakaria and Elisheva, his father. So the question is why? Why is Luke's perspective so much different than Matthew's? Okay, who is Matthew writing to? Israel. He's writing to the Jewish people. Who's Luke writing to? Not as much the Jews.
Yeah.
So what's important to Luke? The priesthood. Zakaria, the goings-on in the temple. The appearance of an angel to the priest in the temple. The prophecy involved with the temple. Okay? All of these things. This gives us an insight. Now, Luke's Greek is spot on. Luke was a Greek speaker. Matthew, a little sloppier. Matthew's first language, definitely Aramaic, and he knows some Greek. Luke, he's a scholar. He's a doctor. He knows Greek. Maybe he knew Aramaic first, but he knows Greek. And so, if his concerns are about the temple, and he has assimilated into the Greek culture enough to be well educated in it, these are indications he was a Sadducee. Does it come out and say he was a Sadducee? No, and it's a topic of conversation amongst scholars even today. There's some scholars who go so far as to say he wasn't Jewish at all, he was Greek. I think that's silly. But was he a Hellenized Jew? In other words, a Sadducee? I think it's very, very, because of his emphasis on things in the temple, on the priesthood, I think it's entirely probable. Okay? So we're getting the story now from the point of view of the Sadducee and the point of view of the Pharisee. That's Matthew. Now, having said this, everybody has to keep in mind that we talk about these different groups at the time as if they were monolithic, right? We got, these guys are Sadducees, yay, and these guys are Pharisees, yay. It wasn't so much like that. It was a big continuum. There were Pharisees with Sadduceic leanings. There were Sadducees with Pharisaic leanings. There were Sadducees that really thought the Essenes had a bunch of things right too, but they were still Sadducees, okay? And there was everything in between, right? Archaeologists who focused so far more on the Pharisees have found more than 20 different sects of Pharisees at that time, evidence of them. And among these sects, some of them had some Sadduceic leanings, Okay? So don't think of these things as monolithically individual. It's sort of a big smear. And there are folks in the middle, right? What do you think? Well, I think the priest is really, really important. And yeah, I go to synagogue, but, for business, I got to deal with the Greeks a lot. And so I take on some Greek stuff too. Just as you would imagine, just as people do today. That being said, Luke's perspective is significantly different than Matthew's. The things that are important to Matthew to tell are not the things that are important for Luke. Right? Luke's perspective has to do with temple and temple miracles. Matthew's, much more with the Chachamim, much more with the sages. And when you look at it and you see it that way, it's kind of obvious. Okay? But it's not generally taught that way. Okay? Why do we have different gospels? Why did Hashem do this for us? And the answer is, first off, to keep us confused, because their perspectives are all different. Okay? But secondly, to show us what the different perspectives were at the time. And where's Mark and all of this? Yeah, not important. Now when his ministry starts, that's important. This stuff before, who cares? And that's Mark's perspective. So as we continue on, and we'll continue to point out the differences in the Christmas story itself from Matthew's and Luke's, or the author of Matthew and the author of Luke's perspective, and why they're different and why they show up that way to us today and what we can learn.